Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Robert Hornung. I'm the president of the Canadian Wind Energy Association, and I think I want to speak to the fact that the next 3 years of work in positive energy still obviously have to be informed by the past 3 years. And a lot of the issues that have been identified and that have been spoken about through the panels up to this point remain a key focus going forward. And I want to highlight a few of those and maybe some additional twists on them. One thing we've heard a lot about over the last day and a half is the need for a vision, a need for a narrative, a need for a plan that provides a broader context for energy decision making. And that's, I think, particularly true if really we're talking here about a transition to a low carbon economy. If we think that the concept of transitioning to a low carbon economy is broadly understood or accepted, I think we're kidding ourselves. I think there's a massive educational effort that's required. And, you know, we might be able to say, in fact, I think everyone who's been up here over the last day has been able to say, yes, we're going to transition to a low carbon economy. Transition's an interesting word. Transition implies there's an end point and that you complete the transition at a certain point. I would argue that there's absolutely zero consensus within Canada as to what that transition endpoint is, which is why everyone can be in favor of the transition and have real debates and discussion about investments in long-lived infrastructure, because some people think that's part of the transition. Some people think, well, it actually is going to extend past the transition. So governments, I think, have a lead role to play in that in terms of setting out that vision. A vision has no credibility unless it's backed up by a plan. A plan builds no confidence unless you can actually demonstrate progress against it. And Canada does have a pretty sorry track record in this regard. But I would say we do have this pan-Canadian framework on clean growth and climate change, which despite all its challenges is by far the most significant effort that we've ever seen in this country to actually develop a vision or a plan. And we should be doing everything we can to maintain that and build on it, something that I think is going to be coming seriously under threat within the next, say, 18 months as we see a few elections going forward. So I think one thing that we've also talked about is the fact that in terms of developing that plan, there needs to be better communication between regulators and policymakers. And I think a useful area of research might be, with respect to the low carbon economy, what would regulators be looking for from governments? What is the information they need? What is the guidance they need? What is the framework they need to have to be able to inform their processes and their work going forward? So I think that's something that could be looked at. The last panel, well, the second theme I want to touch on was community engagement. So the last panel dealt with that in quite a bit of detail, so I won't go to a lot of discussion there. But I did want to highlight a couple things. It's clear that there is a much broader understanding now of the importance of meaningful and effective community engagement, public participation in projects. And I think that there's a lot of evidence, actually, that industry has gotten much better at this over time. Probably not perfect yet by any stretch of the means, but if you think, I think even within the wind industry, if you look at how developers approach communities today compared to how they even approached them 5 years ago, there's been a massive shift, and a very, very positive shift in that regard. And I think one of the things that would be interesting, and this was suggested by an earlier speaker, I think in the first panel, is to, I mean, positive energy has done some good work to look at processes and to say, here are the things that caused issues and problems at the community level. Pick 10 success stories and highlight the things that made those successes. What are the things that we should be working to duplicate, replicate, to build more successes going forward? Because I don't actually think it is rocket science. I think a lot of this stuff, we have actually good concrete examples and can move forward with, and we need to celebrate those. And I guess one last comment with respect to process. You may be interested, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the United States just completed a massive study looking at wind farms all across the United States and trying to understand public opposition to those wind farms. And of course, every wind farm, you'll hear a range of issues coming forward. Some people are concerned about noise or impact on property values or a whole range of different things. The researchers tried to find what is the underlying factor that leads to somebody having a negative perception of a wind farm as opposed to a positive perception, and by far the most dominant factor that influenced that attitude at the end was their perception of the fairness of the process. If you do a process well, you can eliminate a lot of problems. We talk about the challenges in terms of the regulatory process and the amount of time it takes to go through the regulatory process. I would argue that the only way to shorten the amount of time that it takes to go through the regulatory process is to invest a bunch more time before you get to the regulatory process going forward. And I think that's a trend we'll see going in the future. Third point, again, something that's been highlighted, information. The need for independent, quality, publicly accessible information. To be perfectly honest, I've been Mike Cleland would know this. Mike Cleland 20 years ago was trying to bring together industry associations to get the federal government to invest in a central energy information agency. I don't understand how it's possible that 20 years later we still don't have this. And it's clear from all the discussion we've had here that it's an incredibly important tool, not just for the public, but for regulators, for all stakeholders to be able to manage this going forward. And so I would like to suggest that Positive Energy become a key champion working with others to promote that outcome. But I'd also like to highlight one other piece of information that's really important, which is information on the regulatory process itself. I can speak again from experience in the wind energy industry. We've had some provinces which have made some ambitious commitments and said we're moving forward with wind, and then kind of rubbed their hands together and went off to do other things. There have been other provinces who've made similar commitments, and then we actually went out into communities and said, this is why we made this policy decision. This is the direction that we're heading. This is the process that we're going to be following if we're going to be looking at a project and seeing it getting approved. Where did you have much less public opposition? Where government took a lead role in doing that. And government has to play that role because proponents can't explain the process. Proponents already go in with a deficit in terms of public trust. They're obviously there for their own interest. They're trying to make money with this project, all this sort of thing. Government can speak to that and provide some clarity. And the fourth and the last point I wanted to make relates to something Ralph Torrey was talking about in terms of the fact that we're in an era of disruption and change. We have a lot of uncertainty. This is another reason why the information function is really important. When you have new technologies that are emerging, and then you have regulators and others who've never seen this before in Canada or hearing about it for the first time, but you may have a solid track record somewhere else or something, that information has to be made available. People have to be able to deal with that. But I think, as Chris said, the future is going to be different than the past. The rate of change is accelerating. And all of these processes, I think we have to look at with a view of flexibility. And it's a challenge because everyone wants certainty going forward. But we need to, I think, sort of pursue almost an adaptive management kind of approach. That we go forward and I really do think this is an area where perfection is going to be the enemy of the good. If we try to perfect this system, we will never do it. The world will change too fast. We'll always be a step behind. We have to evolve as we go forward and be willing to be continuously learning about how to evolve and adapt these processes going forward. And I think the pressures to do that are only going to increase because literally 6 years from now, we're going to have proposals coming forward that we haven't even envisioned yet at this point.